My name is Susan Tomkiewicz, and I'm coming to you from the Oboe studio at Columbus State University's Schwob School of Music. And today we are playing the GMEA All-State Band Etudes for 2016 for the middle school grades. So we're going to start with the slower etude first, the Cantabile. And we're going to talk about just a couple of technical points and tips that I think might help you as you're trying to prepare for your auditions. So So the first thing I did when I approached this etude was turn on my metronome, so I was sure to learn it at the appropriate tempo. And so with that in mind, I scanned through and I noticed that I'm in the key of B flat. And what that tells me is anytime I have an F coming from a D or going to a D or coming from an E flat or going to an E flat, I'm going to need to use an alternate fingering. So depending on the key mechanism on your oboe, you're either going to use your left F or your forked F. Either one, if you don't have the left F, then you have to use the forked F, and that's totally fine. But what I would suggest is that you mark every single one of those alternate F fingerings into your music. I never rely on my brain. So there's going to be one in the second bar, in the third bar, in the fourth bar, in the fifth bar, the 7th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 15th bar. I mean, there's a lot of them. So what this will do when you mark them in is remove any question when you get to that F of which flavor of F it is you need to use. So I always put that kind of thing into my music so I don't have to think about it when I get there. So certainly do that. In fact, do it right now. I'll wait for you. Okay, so the next thing is the subdivided eighth note at our tempo here of 132 to the eighth note. So what can happen sometimes when you're thinking of that beat, we can shortchange the quarter note a little bit. So if you're practicing with your metronome, it's much easier, of course. And when you turn the metronome off, what I would encourage you to do in your brains is think about that subdivision even though we're not going to hear it. So you can even practice it that way, and it's going to ensure that those quarter notes are really rhythmically accurate. And then you take away that extra articulation, but it's still in my brain. Otherwise, we can tend to push through the quarter notes a little bit, and then our tempo goes a little too fast, and then our rhythm actually sounds like it's incorrect. Another thing that I noticed in this etude were the large number of descending slurred intervals. What can happen on the oboe sometimes is if our embouchure reed placement is not set up properly, we can crack those intervals or it starts to sound a little bit like a donkey. We don't want to sound like a donkey. So what I encourage you to do is make a nice ooh shape with the embouchure and think forward in the ooh. And that helps facilitate the air moving into and through the reed and getting a nice descending slur. I'm trying to find a particularly nasty one here. At the very end, that very last measure, you hear that crack. If I have too much reed in or I'm too tight on the reed, of course I'm not going to do it now. Promise you it will crack and it'll sound like a donkey. It won't sound like a donkey if you have forward, good air, and nice ooh. That gives us more flexibility in the sound and in the space between the intervals. Let me play it with a little more reed in and a little more embouchure rolled in, and we'll see if it cracks or not. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But what you'll notice is that the sound is not as good and the notes won't match up as evenly and sound the same as the one that they're coming from or going to. And that last C sticks out a whole bunch, so I encourage you to do more forward, more in the ooh, and play on the tip of the reed. The more reed you play in, sort of the worse the sound tends to get. You'll notice all of these nice dynamic markings in this etude. So my word of advice there is do them. So try to start at a nice mezzo piano. Don't squeeze so we lose the sound, but a nice sort of relaxed dynamic there so we can come up to our forte in the third bar and then relax again. So we have all of these hairpins written in for our crescendos and our decrescendos, so just be sure to do as best you can the dynamics that are indicated in the music. Another thing to consider in the Cantabile etude is the articulation markings and what we see. We have a lot of slurs, of course, but we also see a lot of tenuto lines. So I think the best way that you can facilitate that with your embouchure and your tongue through the instrument is to think of a do, a softer D and not a T, not a harsh T of the tongue. And that works well because we're already thinking ooh in the embouchure, but then that D gives us sort of a nice sort of bow stroke if you were playing the violin. It's nice and smooth and nice and gentle. If I did that with a harsher T, doesn't work quite so well, and actually that's more appropriate for the second etude. So I encourage you to use a nice do in your articulation, nice soft D. The last thing I guess I want to mention is breathing. This one is not so bad. The etude's not that long and you get these nice little eighth rests throughout. So what I would encourage you not to do is take big giant full inhales. So at the very beginning, notice that I don't. As soon as I do that, I've got too much air and I'm tight up in the chest. So you only have to play 3.5 bars before your next opportunity. So maybe think about filling up the just half of the gas tank. Small breath. I've taken small breaths, so in that second phrase, I use the air, so I'm actually ready for another breath, but I'm not going to take a huge one. Notice I did not breathe there. I don't need it because I have another opportunity in another 2 bars, and that 16th rest is a little bit of a short time there, so it's really going to, I think, break the line of the phrase up just a little too much, so I prefer not to breathe there. And of course I'm going to breathe there. And be sure to count that last note for a full 6 beats. Actually, if you put your metronome on, it should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 off on 1 or on 7. And that will be a full value last note. So that's about all I have for you for this Cantabile etude. Okay, so we're working on the Andante Giocoso, and again, the first thing I did was turn on my metronome so I know what 104 sounds like and what it's going to feel like. And it's not so bad. It's not too fast, but it is a little bit zippy. It's definitely faster than the first one. But what I want to encourage you not to do is push this tempo. Don't go any faster than 104. In fact, I would encourage you to play it at the tempo that you can play it very cleanly and very musically. There's no sense trying to go 104 if it's going to be a big mess. It's better to go slower and do it really well, in my opinion. So we see lots of things in this etude. The first thing, which is unusual, is there's a modulation halfway through. So we start in E flat major, and then by the time we get to the third line, we have A flat major, which makes things a little bit more complicated when we get there. So I again went through the etude and I marked in all of my alternate fingerings, and we've got more than just the alternate Fs, the left or the forked F. In fact, I've got a wide variety of markings in this one. So while we are in the key of E flat, I have multiple left Fs that I'm marking, or if you don't have the left F on your oboe, you'll be marking your forked Fs. So there's one in the first bar, in the third bar, bar 5, and bar 7. And that's really all we have for alternate fingerings in the first half. When we get to the second half, it gets a little more complicated because we're modulating to A flat and we add in the D flat. So we've got a left E flat in bar 9, and we'll get a close-up of my fingers in just a second so you can kind of see a little bit of the fingering gymnastics that we have to go through in the second half of this etude. In bar 11, both of those E flats need to be taken on the left-hand side. In bar 12, we've got D flat to left E flat, then a forked F, then a left E flat to D flat, forked F to regular E flat. You get to use your regular E flat there if you want to. And then in bar 13, which I think is one of the more complicated ones, coming up the scale, C, D flat, we need to use our left E flat there, which then causes a problem for us going to the A flat. You need to actually take the A flat on the right hand side. So this key here on the right is your right hand A flat. We'll show you that in just a second. And then we've got in bar 14, D flat to left E flat, forked F, left E flat, D flat, left E flat, forked F, G, A flat. And then we've got some more forked F and some more left E flats in the last couple of bars. It's a little complicated, but again, I would write in every single one of those. I use an L for either my left F or the left E flat. When I'm using forked F, I make a little pitchfork sign, which is kind of fun. So I've got little pitchforks on my forked Fs, and then I have an R on that right A flat that I need to use in the upper octave in bar 13. So what I'm going to do is just play really slowly from measure 9 to the end, and you can see all of the different alternate fingerings that I'm using. So here we go. So you saw me go to the left left E flat there in measure 9. There's nothing funny in measure 10, so I'm going to skip over to measure 11. Same thing, both of those E flats will be left E flats, and if that's this key here that you'll use with your pinky, sort of on the inside. And I have to use left there because I'm going to the D flat. It's going to slow you down to try to slide from this E flat to the D flat here, so we've got to use that alternate E flat. Here's measure 12. So there's D flat, E flat, forked F, E flat, D flat, forked F, E flat, and so those first two E flats must be left E flat. You can continue through and use left E flat on beat 3, it's totally fine, or you can use the regular, it's up to you. Continuing. So left E flat, right A flat, excuse me. That's a little bit tricky, so just practice it slowly. The next measure, 14. So D flat, left E flat, forked F, left E flat, D flat, left E flat, forked F, G, A flat, and then so practice these fingerings really slowly for starters. There's no use trying to practice them really fast because they won't get stuck in your fingers. You won't get the muscle memory. So go slowly, practice all of the alternate fingering slowly, and go measure by measure. So take one measure at a time if you're in measure 13. and just practice the little pieces. And then the other thing, try to keep your fingers really low and relaxed down to the keys. If they're flying all over the place, there's going to be less likelihood that your fingers will even come down in the right place on the keys. And it's going to make it sound a little more harsh too. You kind of heard what that did to my sound, and I didn't really mean to change anything there. It was just what I did to my fingers. So practice slowly. Practice with your fingers really low to the keys and without a lot of finger pressure. We don't want a lot of percussion here. We play the oboe. And then just take a sensible tempo and try to be as musical as you can. So hopefully this helps. So I'll just play from measure 9 to the end for you, and we're going to get a close-up of my fingers, but we'll go sort of slow so you can see what they're doing. But again, I've marked in every single one of my alternate fingerings, so there's no question when I get there. I see a variety of articulations on this one. We do have some slurred notes, we have some staccato notes, we have some accents, and we have some accents and tenutos. So you're going to do your best to try to make a difference between all of those articulations. So my advice is on the staccato notes, just make them somewhat separated but light. Don't put a lot of T in the tongue on those guys. So just kind of bubbly and buoyant. Now when you get to beats 3 and 4 in the first measure, we need some accent, but they want those notes long. Here's where you get to use your T. So in the first etude, we're going to use a nice do articulation. In this one, we need ta, 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 ta. So make sure the notes are long, but lots of T in the tongue there. So the last articulation is just the straight accented notes. So for example, in measure 5, so on the B flat and the E flat at the end of measure 5, again, some punch with the T in the tongue, but we need a little more space than, say, the quarter notes in the first measure because they don't have the tenuto line there. The last thing that I will say about the articulation are the groups of 2 slurred 16th notes. For example, we've got 2 of them in the second measure. Oftentimes those tend to get smushed a little bit, and the measure or the figure actually becomes too quick off of the first 16th note. And the 2 notes are not evenly spaced. So you want to be sure that you really blow through the first of each of those, and in this case they both happen to be A flats in the second measure. So they're 2 even 16th notes and say not like a 32nd instead of a 16th note on the first one. And that happens all over the place. I don't see many measures where there's not a couple of slurred notes together. Pay attention to the dynamics that are marked. Make as much dynamic difference as you can. But the last thing I really wanted to talk about was the breathing. Again, this one's kind of nice in that you get all of these little 8th note rest breaks about every couple of bars. So don't fill up the air tank the whole way. So in the first measure, I'm just going to take a little breath, really enough to get me through the first 2 bars. And you notice I'm just going to open my embouchure and kind of release a little bit of pressure. So it's kind of an out breath, but I'm not forcing the air out of me. In. So I did grab a little inhale on the 8th rest in bar 6, but now I have this big fat quarter rest at the end of bar 8 that I can do whatever I want there. I'm going to let a little air out, and I'm going to take a good breath in and prepare for the key change in measure 9. Out. In. and really soft. Use the crescendo in bars 13 and 14 to your advantage. We have a motto in the oboe studio here: when in doubt, two things. Blow more air, because that helps with the confidence and it helps the sound actually happen on the instrument. And the other one is play more musically, and that actually comes from a very well-known teacher at the Eastman School of Music, Mr. Kilmer. Thank you for that, Mr. Kilmer. So each beat in measure 13 through measure 14, kind of think of it as a next step up on the volume scale. So each beat getting a little bit louder till we get to the A flat in bar 14, then keep going. Then really we keep that volume level through the very end of the etude.